Hello everyone and welcome. I am the moderator for today. My name is Lisa Joyce and I'm a Products and Regulatory Partner at Mason Hayes & Curran LLP. One of the big legal trends over the last few years has been an increase in regulation generally across a lot of regulated sectors, and EU product regulation is certainly no different. Today, we're going to look at the EU Market Surveillance Regulation, or the MSR, and what you need to know. In particular, we're going to look at the key points and practical considerations that need to be borne in mind by economic operators getting ready for this new legislation, which is going to take full effect on the 16th of July 2021, so not long to go now. And we're also going to look at the enhanced market surveillance powers that are being introduced. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues from our products regulatory team, James or Jamie Gallagher and Saadi Siddiqui. Together, we advise on the full life cycle of EU product regulation and compliance, from product development to launch, as well as post-market enforcement and engagement with regulatory authorities. We also advise clients across all sectors, such as pharmaceuticals, medical devices, digital health, food, cosmetics, electronics, and other general consumer products. So moving to our agenda for today, which I think is on the next slide. So Jamie is going to deal with the first four agenda items, which is the scope of the MSR, whether you are an economic operator for the purposes of the legislation, the obligations that follow if you are, and some special considerations for online retailers. And then Saadi is going to look lastly at the market surveillance authorities and their enhanced powers. So lastly, I just wanted to say that we will have some time for questions and answers at the end of the session. We hope about 10 minutes or so. If you would like to raise a question, you can do so at any time throughout the webinar by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter your question that way. You can do so anonymously or you can add your name. It's entirely up to you. So I'll hand over now to Jamie, who is going to look firstly at the scope of the MSR. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome everyone. So as a way of starting into our first topic, which is the scope of the MSR, I thought it might be useful to first just explain what we're talking about when we use this term market surveillance. So if we take the next slide, please. Now, that might seem like something that's very basic, but I think it is worth using that as our jumping off point, seeing as the scope of the new regulation and the various topics that we're going to get into in further detail really are based on a clear understanding of what market surveillance is and why it's important. So I've placed the definition as set out in Article 3 of the MSR up here, and I won't read it out to you, but you can see that market surveillance is obviously a broad term that covers a whole range of activities, but the whole point is really to make sure that EU legislation in relation to products placed on the market is being complied with. How compliance with that EU legislation is monitored and enforced is left very much as a matter for member states. But what pieces of legislation like the MSR are designed to do is to provide for an EU-wide system that can coordinate those national activities, which is a job that's becoming more and more challenging as supply chains have become more and more sophisticated. If we take the next slide, please, and just briefly to provide some more background, the predecessor to this new regulation is the RAMS regulation, which, among other things, provided for the EU market surveillance regime that we have today. But in the time since the coming into force of RAMS, we have had this increase in the variety of ways that EU consumers buy products, who they buy them from, where those sellers are based, and how those products make their way from those sellers to EU consumers. So the job of effective market surveillance has become correspondingly more complicated and challenging. And that essentially is where the impetus for an updated market surveillance regulation has come from. So you will have had many stakeholders expressing concern over the gaps in the current system that have emerged from the development of increasingly long and complex supply chains on one hand, but also the rise of web-based business models that were not half as prevalent when legislation like RAMS was being drafted. And that's something that's, I suppose, pretty much epitomized by online sales, which can by their nature make it very difficult to identify those responsible for compliance with EU products legislation, particularly where you have online sales direct to EU consumers from sellers outside of the EU, which is obviously something that's become more and more common. And it's because of things like that that market surveillance was recognized as something requiring enhanced legislation in the EU communication on the goods package. So I've placed a relevant extract from the Commission communication in this slide, and I'm not going to read through all of it, but just to pick out the highlights, you can see there that there is this recognition that the world that EU consumers live in is now increasingly globalized and digitized. And what is required is a market surveillance system capable of spanning member state borders, as well as that physical online divide as well. So if we take the next slide, please, and bearing all that in mind, the first key thing to say about the scope of the new regulation is that it's very broad in terms of the products that it applies to. I've placed Article 2 up just to illustrate that. And the key thing that I want to highlight is that definition of union harmonization legislation and how that can be anything listed in Annex 1. And Annex 1 is a list of some 70 pieces of legislation that cover anything and everything from medical devices and IVDs through to toys, tobacco products, cosmetics. There are the various chemicals and hazardous substances regulations and directives, so things like REACH and ROS and the biocides regulation. And you also have the various pieces of legislation relevant to electrical and electronic equipment. So you have things like electromagnetic compatibility, so EMC, radio equipment, RED, WE, LVD, and the batteries directive, and the list goes on. So the point is that the new regulation is obviously designed to cast this very wide net in terms of the products that it applies to. And as we'll see in another slide shortly, the new regulation is also quite ambitious in scope when we turn to consider how it seeks to pin down the various types of economic operators under Article 4 and give them specific duties in respect of what is still quite a broad subset of those 70 pieces of legislation in Annex 1. And also just to mention, although we're going to go on now and focus on economic operators, and Sadi is going to speak on the enhanced powers of the market surveillance authorities, which is another extension in scope. But the new regulation is also pretty ambitious when it comes to coordination and communication between market surveillance authorities, as well as the powers that those authorities have to carry out their functions. So an example of that would be the way that products deemed to be non-compliant in one member state shall be presumed to be non-compliant in other member states. So although we might be more interested in what the new regulation means for me or actors in my supply chain on the economic operator side, I think you can only really fully understand those obligations by thinking about them in the context of this more networked, coordinated EU level regulatory system that the market surveillance regulation is designed to foster. So the way that the legislation addresses market surveillance from those different angles and on those different levels is also a point worth mentioning under the heading of scope as well. And if we take the next slide, please. And in terms of confirming whether or not you're an economic operator, we take the next slide again, please. The first thing to explain here is maybe the significance of being designated as an economic operator in the first place. So that's a concept it's obviously not a new thing, and under existing EU legislation, being a manufacturer or an authorized representative or an importer or a distributor brings with various responsibilities in terms of ensuring the compliance of products in circulation in the EU market. And an important thing to note there is that overall, being an economic operator makes you part of the EU market surveillance system. So as well as setting out the nature of the various roles and the obligations and responsibilities attaching to those roles, the Commission in the Blue Guide makes that clear, that economic operators have this active role in terms of market surveillance. And as we'll see, this new market surveillance regulation is extending who can be an economic operator and what obligations an economic operator has, especially when it comes to things like online sales and products coming from sellers established outside of the EU. So we can begin to see that when we note that there are actually two slightly different definitions of what an economic operator is in the MSR. So you can view the second one as maybe more of a subset of the first, but given the breadth of that first Article 3 definition, it will more likely than not often become more a case of figuring out which type of economic operator you are instead of whether or not you are an economic operator at all. And that's important because the first type of economic operator has more general obligations to cooperate with market surveillance authorities, whereas the economic operator under Article 4 has this more active role. And I've placed the Article 3 definition on this slide, and we can see that as well as the manufacturer, the authorised representative, the importer, the distributor, the fulfilment service provider, it also covers any other natural or legal person subject to obligations under legislation relating to the manufacture, making available or putting into service of products. So that obligation to cooperate applies again to a very broad range of actors in the supply chain. However, when we look then at Article 4, which sets out the requirement for an economic operator established in the EU to have responsibility for various tasks in terms of regulatory compliance, we can see that a narrower definition is used. So maybe the more important issue becomes one of checking whether or not there needs to be that Article 4 economic operator in place. And I've placed the definition there and highlighted how an Article 4 economic operator is responsible for certain further tasks. And we're going to look at those tasks under paragraph 3 in further detail in the next section. But in the next few slides, I just want to first break down that definition of what an Article 4 economic operator is a little further. So if we take the next slide, please. And just briefly, you know, Article 4 requires an economic operator established in the EU when two criteria are satisfied. So firstly, the product needs to fall within the scope of the legislation that's listed in Article 4 under paragraph 5. And I've set out the list of categories that sub-list of legislation pertains to. And you can see there that legislation set out within Article 4 still accounts for a very broad variety of products. And then secondly, the requirements under Article 4 apply in respect to those types of products that are placed on the EU market on or after 16 July 2021, which is when this new regulation will take effect. And just quickly to note that placing on the market means to make the product available on the EU market for the first time. So these types of products that are listed in Article 4, placed on the market on or after 16 July 2021, will require that Article 4 economic operator established in the EU to be in place. And the next question is then who can be that economic operator and carry out those tasks. So if we take the next slide, please, and I've set out the various types of economic operator identified under Article 4 there, and the first three are reasonably straightforward. However, it is worth highlighting that where there is no EU manufacturer, authorized representative or importer, but a fulfillment service provider established in the EU is handling the product, that fulfillment service provider is the economic operator under Article 4. And I've placed the definition there of fulfillment service provider as any natural or legal person offering in the course of commercial activity at least two of the services of warehousing, packaging, addressing and dispatching, and it doesn't involve ownership of the products, and the definition also excludes postal services. And it's that addition of the fulfillment service provider that is quite significant, because previously that type of entity wouldn't necessarily have been considered as an economic operator, even though they can now often be the last pair of hands that touches the product on its way to the consumer, and often actually the only pair of hands in the EU that handles the product before it reaches an EU consumer as well. So in this provision, the new regulation is recognizing that, and a key thing for fulfillment service providers to realize is that if they're handling one of these Article 4 products for a client seller that is based outside of the EU, and that seller doesn't have an importer or an authorized representative already in the EU, the fulfillment service provider becomes the Article 4 economic operator, and that triggers a set of obligations that importers and authorized representatives might already be more used to, but fulfillment service providers wouldn't have ordinarily have had to deal with up until now. So if we take the next slide, please. And in terms of identifying which economic operators should be responsible for Article 4 obligations and how they go about complying with those obligations, the Commission has also issued guidance on the practical implementation of Article 4, which also includes a set of useful decision steps. And it also provides practical guidance for the various types of economic operators in terms of their Article 4 obligations. But before we move on to talk about those obligations in some further detail, it is important to note that the decision steps finish on this sixth step, which makes it clear in the guidance that where you have a trader based outside of the EU seeking to move one of these Article 4 products from outside of the EU directly to an end user in the EU, there does need to be one of these economic operators, so an authorized representative or an importer or a fulfillment service provider, to be their EU-based economic operator under Article 4. And without that EU-based economic operator in place, the product can't be offered to EU end users. So if we take the next slide, please, and just quickly to recap before moving on to look at what this type of Article 4 economic operator has to do. We've taken a look at what market surveillance is and the scope of the new regulation, and also what type of economic operator can be, with the addition of fulfillment service providers. So next we're going to look at obligations. And just to note that I'm focusing here on obligations of the Article 4 economic operator here. So if we take the next slide, please, and beyond confirming that a product triggers the need to have an EU-based Article 4 economic operator, the question then becomes, what does that economic operator have to do? And there are three main headings here which feed back into the general objective of the regulation, which is to enhance the ability of national regulators to carry out market surveillance activities, regardless of whether the product is made outside or inside the EU, or whether it's bought online or offline. So firstly, the Article 4 economic operator has to perform a number of tasks when it takes up its duties or when a new product is added to its portfolio. And in terms of verifying that the declaration of conformity and technical documentation has been drawn up and having it available. And just to note that that doesn't necessarily mean that this Article 4 economic operator has to keep that documentation itself. But where it doesn't, it does need to check that firstly, that documentation exists, and it does need to obtain assurances from the manufacturer that those documents can be shared on request, either with or through the Article 4 economic operator, who can then pass them on to the authorities, or with the authorities directly. If we take the next slide, please, and look at the second obligation, which revolves around scenarios where the Article 4 economic operator has reason to believe that a product presents a risk, and it has to inform the relevant authorities, and it has to do that in each member state in which the product has been made available. And it's also important to inform the authorities of the corrective action that has or will be taken. And in terms of that corrective action, it has to make sure that that action is taken immediately to remedy any case of non-compliance, or where that's not possible, to mitigate the risk. And I'm going to go into a little more detail on what that can involve in a moment later on as part of this section. So if we take the next slide, please, and the third and final heading deals with Article 4 economic operators having to take certain action when asked to do so by a market surveillance authority. So they're required to do things like provide the declaration of conformity. They have to provide the technical documentation, or as we've mentioned, where they don't keep that themselves, they have to ensure that that documentation can be provided to the authority where requested. And they have to provide other information or documentation like certificates or decisions from notified bodies, for example, and that needs to be provided in a language that can be understood by the requesting national authority. And they also need to cooperate with the authority, and that obligation is obviously very open-ended. It's going to be case by case. It'll always be, I suppose, framed by the request for cooperation that the Market Surveillance Authority is making. But one, I suppose, reference point we have in the regulation is in Article 14, which provides that any such request for cooperation has to be made in accordance with the principle of proportionality. If we take the next slide, please. And finally, under that, at that third heading of things that need to be done when asked by a Market Surveillance Authority, although it also comes up under things to do when a product presents a risk, there is also this onus on the Article 4 economic operator to make sure that the necessary corrective action is taken immediately to remedy any non-compliance, or if that's not possible, to mitigate the risks. So that corrective action can involve, bringing the product into conformity, or withdrawing it, or recalling it. But it's just important to note that the economic operator under Article 4 doesn't have to take that corrective action or mitigate the risk itself. And that's on the basis that it doesn't already have to do that under any sector-specific legislation. But under the market surveillance regulation, what it has to do is make sure that that necessary action is taken. So that's slightly more limited than having to take that action itself. And an example of taking steps to make sure that the action is taken would be, for example, making sure that the manufacturer was aware of the request or the need for corrective action, and asking the manufacturer to respond to that request and verifying that it has done so. So in terms of timeframes, the guidance also clarifies that the Article 4 economic operator needs to take these steps and carry out these duties within a reasonable time frame, or within any deadline set by a market surveillance authority, and that it should also do things like provide the declaration of conformity without delay, and provide other supporting documentation and information within a reasonable period of time as well. Where the economic operator finds that it cannot fulfill one or more of its tasks due to some sort of problem manifesting in the relationship with the manufacturer. So maybe the manufacturer is not responding to these requests or notifications that some type of corrective action is required. An appropriate follow-up in that sort of instance might be to remind the manufacturer of its obligations under EU legislation, and that's something that's also suggested in the guidance. And then if the problem persists, the logical consequence would be, and this is also provided for in the guidance, would be to take necessary measures to cease being the Article 4 economic operator in respect of the products in question. So in the case of an importer, that would mean no longer placing the products on the market. If you were an authorized representative, you could begin to take steps to end your relationship with the manufacturer in respect of the product in question. Or as a fulfillment service provider, you could withdraw your agreement to handle the products in question and not dispatch them on to end users in the EU. And finally, the economic operator referred to in Article 4 can be sanctioned if it doesn't fulfill its tasks. And Article 41 of the regulation requires member states to lay down rules on penalties, and those penalties will vary from member state to member state, but they do have to be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive under Article 41. So before moving on, and just to recap again, I think we can take the next slide, please. We've covered now the origins of the new regulation, what an economic operator in the context of this new regulation is, especially in terms of Article 4. And now we've looked at what the duties of that Article 4 economic operator are. So in the next section, I want to cover, we're going to deal with some special considerations for online retailers. So if we take the next slide, please. And so turning to online sales and online retailers, I think it's worth just mentioning again how this new regulation has really been drafted with online sales in mind. And I've included the wording of Article 6 just to highlight how online and distance sales are specifically mentioned, but also as a means of going into a little further detail on the meaning of making available on the market in the context of e-commerce and online sales. So I won't read the quoted text, but just to note how the questions of whether or not an offer is being targeted at end users in the Union and whether or not an economic operator is directing its activities to a member state become very relevant here. And the question of whether or not that an offer is being directed in that way is ultimately determined on a case-by-case basis, having regard to things like the locations to which delivery is possible, the languages used for the offer or for the ordering or on the website, and the means of payment and currencies used and the like. A document that is quite useful on this is the Notice on Market Surveillance of Products Sold Online, which confirms that if you're doing things like delivering to addresses in the EU, accepting euro as payment or using any EU language, you're directing activities to EU consumers. And that document also refers to other factors such as things like the international nature of the activity, and also looking to see for things like whether or not a domain name registered in an EU member state is being used, for example. So this is just to highlight that firstly, online sales are specifically provided for in the new regulation, and also how products offered for sale online are deemed to be made available on the EU market. If we take the next slide, please. And another important consideration in the context of online sales is this distinction that exists between an online retailer who is an economic operator making products available on the market and an online marketplace who is merely hosting that offer. So the Commission guidance on the practical implementation of Article 4 confirms that although Article 4 does apply to products sold through online marketplaces, it places no specific obligations on the online marketplace where that online marketplace, who's only hosting the offer of a third-party seller and is not themselves a manufacturer, importer, authorized representative, or fulfillment service provider in respect to the product. So in this sense, the new regulation aligns with the e-commerce directive in that the duty of the online marketplace is not to monitor or vet the sellers directing activities to end users in the EU. Rather, and as set out in that final sentence quoted from Recital 16, they're required to remove or disable access to illegal content where they become aware that this is being hosted on their platform. So in this context, that illegal content or activity would be the offering for sale of a product that was not compliant with Article 4 of the new regulation. So in other words, it was an Article 4 product that didn't have an economic operator capable of discharging those Article 4 obligations in the EU. And an example of being made aware of that is contained in the guidance as something like a sufficiently precise and adequately substantiated notice from a market surveillance authority, as just one example. So if we take the next slide, and I don't plan to go into much detail here, but just to note as well that when looking at online marketplaces, the legislation, including the recycle we had on the last slide, and on this slide, in terms of Article 7, refers to information society service providers. And that's a term that covers a very broad range of online service providers in the digital services and e-commerce context. So just to mention that as we turn to Article 7, which provides that these types of online service providers, like economic operators under the more general Article 3 definition that we looked at earlier, also have this more general duty to cooperate with market surveillance authorities as well. And added to that, the Commission guidance on the implementation of Article 4 also clarifies that in cases where illegal content of the type that I described on the last slide is brought to the attention of an online marketplace, so that the online marketplace in that instance has obtained that actual knowledge or awareness about it, and the requirement is to act expeditiously to remove or disable access to it. So although online marketplaces are not necessarily, well, they aren't economic operators under Article 4 if they're this sort of purely online hosting service, and for example, they don't provide any type of fulfillment services, and it would still be necessary, and it will still be necessary, to cooperate with market surveillance authorities by disabling access to products that are in breach of the new regulation, if and when that's brought to their attention. So if we take the next slide, please. And so online sales are specifically provided for in the new regulation, and there's this distinction between an online retailer and an online marketplace. And just returning to the online retailer, who is this seller directing activities to an EU member state under Article 6, and specifically the online retailer who's based outside of the EU with plans to offer products to consumers in the EU. I suppose the question becomes, what do you need to do in advance of 16th of July when the new regulation comes into force? And so I suppose firstly, although it's not even on the slide, but the first thing you need to check is whether or not the product in question is subject to that legislation, those categories set out under Article 4, so that subset of the Annex 1 list. But on the basis that it is, and then before turning to sort out who your Article 4 economic operator in the EU is going to be, obviously you need to be happy, and you need to satisfy yourself that the product in question is in compliance with the relevant, the applicable EU legislation, and has a declaration of conformity and valid technical documentation demonstrating that. And once that is in order, the guidance on practical implementation also sets out some practical points for this. And the first and easiest solution is one where there's actually already an authorized representative in place for the product under product specific legislation. So in a number of cases, an authorized representative will already be in place and in a position to discharge functions under Article 4. But for those products where there was previously no need to have that authorized representative under product specific legislation, there are then a number of further practical suggestions in the guidance, such as you can approach your online marketplace to see if this might be a service that they offer. You can check and see whether you have contact with an authorized representative in respect of other products in your portfolio, and see if that authorized representative might add your Article 4 product or products as part of their existing mandate, or you can even go through a trade association as a means of being put in touch with a body who might take on those authorized representative services for you. Just on the online marketplaces option, and just to note that the new regulation does seem to have created a type of business opportunity for certain online marketplaces who are now offering to be your contact point for market surveillance authorities in Europe for a fee. And although it was and still is open to online marketplaces to leave this all as a matter for sellers, the reality is that many of the big players do seem to be embracing this new regime and using it as a way to either expand their service offering or to promote their commitment to product safety and consumer protection by offering information and education to sellers. So that is, I suppose, encouraging to see from the perspective of both sellers who might lack the resources to secure compliance in other ways, and also regulators and consumers who realistically do require the participation and cooperation of online platforms for these enhanced market surveillance measures to work as they're intended. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Sadi, who's going to bring us through some of the enhanced powers of market surveillance authorities.
Thanks, JB. That's sorry, I was on mute there. No, thanks, JB. That was great. So as Lisa was saying, I'll talk about the issue of enforcement. So if we can move on to the first slide, please, and just skip over. Thank you. So just in terms of structure, first, I'll start with a quick background. Secondly, talk about market surveillance authorities. And finally, discuss the powers they have under the MSR. So let's just look at the first point as a background. The MSR came about primarily because stakeholders repeatedly pointed out the enforcement gaps under the current system. So while authorities do have the usual powers to request documents, enter premises, and so on, under the current system, they're somewhat vague. For instance, the range of documents or information that can be requested isn't really clear. The powers are limited in scope. For example, they don't account for the rapid rise of technology or online sales. Plus, enforcement across EU member states has been quite fragmented. And with that in mind, we'll use the second and third bullet points to see how these concerns are addressed. This is the next few slides, so if we can move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So let's first talk about market surveillance authorities. The MSR requires EU member states to designate one or more market surveillance authorities, or MSAs as they're called, in their territories. The MSR then provides these MSAs with powers. The idea behind these powers is to ensure an effective level of market surveillance. And this is for products both offline and online. And the overarching aim, as with most product regulatory legislation, is consumer protection. So economic operators are prohibited from placing unsafe, defective, or otherwise non-compliant products on the market. And as Janie mentioned earlier, the MSR requires economic operators to ensure that corrective action is taken to remedy non-compliance or to take steps to mitigate any of those risks. And often, interestingly, these are prompted by an investigation or direction by a regulatory authority. So in this connection, what the MSR does is it requires MSAs to act when economic operators fail to take these corrective actions. And this ties in quite neatly with the general obligation for economic operators to cooperate with MSAs, which was discussed earlier. If we move on to the next slide, please. So with this backdrop, we move on to the third segment, what powers do MSAs have under the legislation? The MSR states that member states must confer on their MSAs the power of market surveillance, investigation, and enforcement necessary for the application of the MSR and for the application of EU harmonization legislation. So this is the range of legislation Jamie was talking about earlier. And then the powers are broad ranging, and it sets out a minimum number of powers, and that's important to remember. It's a minimum number of powers that member states must confer on their MSAs. And in the next slides, we'll look at what these are. Next slide, please. So first is the power to require economic operators to provide relevant documents. This power is quite broadly described. So the relevant documents would include technical specifications, information on compliance, technical aspects of products, access to embedded software. Again, documents can be in any form, any storage format. The MSAs have the power to take copies, and that's documents. And second one is the power to require economic operators to provide relevant information. Again, quite broad, includes information on the supply chain, on the details of distribution network, on quantities of products in the market, on other products that might have same technical characteristics as well. And just so you know how broad this power is, it extends to relevant information ascertaining ownership of websites that's related to the product. So it's really broad. And then you have the powers that's related to entering premises, search and investigation. Again, very wide. There's power to carry out unannounced on-site inspections and physical checks of products, power to enter any premises, land, or means of transport. There's also the power to start investigations on the MSA's own initiative as well. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Well, look at the other powers. Thanks. So as mentioned before, the MSAs must have the power to require economic operators to take appropriate actions to bring an instance of non-compliance to an end or to eliminate that risk. So where an economic operator fails to take appropriate actions, MSAs have the power to take appropriate measures. So what do these measures look like? So these can include power to prohibit or restrict making available of a product on the market, or to order withdrawal or recall. There's also the power to impose penalties. Again, something Jamie was talking about earlier. The MSAs also have the power to acquire product samples, and interestingly, the power to remove content from and restrict access to an online interface. So again, really broad powers. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. One thing I think that's really important to remember for manufacturers, particularly, is the presumption of non-compliance. I know Jamie touched on this issue before, but it's just worth reiterating and bearing in mind. So what this does is essentially products that are deemed non-compliant by an MSA in one member state will be presumed to be non-compliant in another member state. And there's limited exception to this, and this is where the MSA in another member state concluded to the contrary on the basis of its own investigation. So with that, I'll end my segment on enforcement and give the floor back to Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sadi and Jamie.